Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It looks like we're ready to start. A very warm welcome to this virtual event co-sponsored by Canada and the EU in collaboration with the UN Special Rapporteur, Dr. Ahmed Shaheed, on countering anti-Muslim hatred as an obstacle to freedom of religion and belief. My name is Merete Bilder and I'm your moderator for today. This event will be also live streamed on the EU Delegation's Facebook and YouTube channel if you are so interested. Allow me to start by giving the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Walter Stevens, head of the EU Delegations in Geneva, for his welcoming remarks.
Well, thank you very much. Do you hear me clearly? I have basically an echo, but okay. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this annual event on freedom of religion or belief. We know that, of course, during the Human Rights Council, time is money, and we are therefore very grateful that so many of you have decided to join us. And I would very much like to thank Canada for co-sponsoring this event, and of course the Special Rapporteur Ahmed Shaheed for his valued cooperation, and as well as, of course, the esteemed panelists and Tommaso Iamparino, the European Commission coordinator on combating anti-Muslim hatred in Europe. The European Union is strongly committed to promoting the right of freedom of religion or belief. That is also why every year we present a resolution on freedom of religion or belief to the Human Rights Council. That's also why we are so attached to the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. But even more so, we are convinced that respect for this right and the full enjoyment of the right to religion or belief, and I mean all religions, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, whatever, contributes to the building of pluralistic, tolerant, democratic societies. It is also intrinsically linked to freedom of opinion, expression, of peaceful assembly, of association. Taken together, these fundamental freedoms play an important role in the fight against all forms of intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief. And we should not shy away from difficult issues. Clearly, nobody is perfect. We are not perfect. The issue is, are you ready to address shortcomings? Are you ready to do something about it? Following the latest report of the Special Rapporteur, as it was presented to the Human Rights Council, today's topic is related to anti-Muslim hatred and how this phenomenon contributes to discrimination and intolerance against Muslims or people perceived to be Muslims. As a European Union, we agree that combating discrimination and hatred against Muslims and those perceived to be Muslims needs to be addressed. And we do a lot, and you will hear certainly in presentations what we're trying to do. Combating discrimination is essential as part of efforts to uphold human rights, to protect human dignity, and always respect for each other's values. Therefore, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you, Ahmed, first, and then from the other panelists, and I will follow the debate with great interest. Thank you, Merete.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Stevens. And with this, I suggest we dive right into it and give the floor to Special Rapporteur Ahmed Shaheed so that he can set the scene for a panel debate. Ahmed, you have the floor.
Thank you, Merete. First of all, I would like to thank the co-sponsors for organizing this event and for inviting me. It's really real pleasure to join this eminent panel of experts to discuss this subject. I'll talk about very briefly why I read the report, how I read the report, what I found, and what can be done. So why I read the report is there appears to be a real conceptual gap, protection gap with regard to the rights of those who are Muslim or perceived to be Muslim. And it appears to be the case that for a number of years now, well over a decade, that the Council has really not made much progress on this issue by a false conflict between protecting Muslims and blasphemy laws, which of course has kind of stymied efforts to look at this issue. So I want to look at the conceptual contours of this issue and then perhaps suggest ways out of that normative and protection gap. How I did this was through empirical research. So I called for submissions, received 109 submissions, so quite an extensive set of submissions for this mandate. And then I interviewed 15 scholars and others who are experts in this field, held 12 roundtables covering all the regions of the world. So quite extensive empirical research went into this report. What I found is not surprising in terms of what we see in terms of the violence around the world, but also discrimination ranging from overt ones to indirect ones to what are called microaggressions as well, quite endemic in many ways. And so what is really concerning here is the circle, a vicious circle I called it, between negative stereotyping of Muslims and their beliefs and state structures that perpetuate discrimination and how they reinforce each other. Of course, all of these happen in the shadow of the securitization that's been occurring as part of the war on terror. And in many cases, things had gone to a level where many communities felt that they were in a situation where they felt they could not be visibly Muslim or publicly Muslim because of the either the hatred that they would incur from people or for discrimination that they find in work, in access to in social services. So a wide range of levels of discrimination that possibly meet the threshold in Article 18.2 about prohibition of coercion, because access to if access to service does mean that they have to hide their identity, then there's a problem. A lot of this, of course, runs on the basis of essentializations of Muslims and negative stereotyping of Islam as well. However, it's very important to distinguish a critique of religion, insult to Islam, even cartoons and so on, from this phenomenon, because we're talking about what individuals face in regard to discrimination and violence and abuse, not what is done to a set of ideas that they may be espousing. That has to be distinguished, although in some contexts the two can be linked up. So what I propose we do, my report goes in detail in terms of what can be done, but I do not propose any new frameworks. I am reiterating the implementation of existing frameworks, which in fact have been developed in some sense to address this issue. An example would be this year, we will mark the 10th anniversary of Resolution 1618 passed by the Human Rights Council, which is about combating negative stereotyping, stigmatization, and incitement to discrimination and violence against persons on the basis of their religion or identity. So it was designed to address issues like this, of course, for all faith communities. But we're seeing over the past 10 years, there really hasn't been much uptake, although I should commend Singapore and the Netherlands recently for having picked up what had become an initiative that was kind of getting out of use there. So there's a possible revival, but I am surprised to find that this year also only 12 states sent information to the OSHR with regard to what they were doing to implement this framework. So it's important to implement this framework. The other is the Rabat plan of action, which provides guidance to states on how to respond to hate speech, which says two important things. First of all, we must criminalize hate speech at a very high threshold, the threshold of incitement to violence, discrimination against individuals, based on a context assessment rather than on content-based censorship. The second is at levels below that, do not criminalize. So insult to religion will be like that, but always stand up and contest negative stereotyping and hate speech towards other people. So solidarity to be mobilized to support those who are targeted rather than criminal sanction. The third instrument is the 1981 UN Declaration on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on religion or belief. Again, it's almost 40 years old now, and this identifies a set of rights all persons are entitled to seek and enjoy in regard to their religion or belief. And this importantly says that any discrimination based upon their faith-based identity is illegal under this covenant. So any impairment of the enjoyment of a human right, economic, social, cultural, political, civil, any of these rights, if they're impaired on account of action taken because of one's identity, that's illegal. So this means enjoyment of religious freedom carries with it a very important protection against non-discrimination. The final one I want to refer to is the UNESCO Declaration of Principles on Tolerance. Here, of course, tolerance means in a very broad sense accepting the other, not simply tolerating the other in a negative sense, but a very positive action of actually accepting the difference and diversity in which people exist. So this would be an important tool to promote mutual understanding. This means we require to educate each other, we require to learn about each other in a peer-to-peer exchange scenario rather than stereotypes, and to invest in that, which also brings me to a recommendation that all states must encourage their civil society organizations on an inclusive basis to define Islamophobia. I found the term Islamophobia to be an appropriate term. I have not used this term before because of the concern about blasphemy laws, but I found that anti-Muslim hatred was a term too narrow for the purposes of addressing this phenomenon. If you apply it with the Rabat Plan of Action, Islamophobia provides a frame within which you can capture both the street-level prejudice and hate, as well as the institutional system of discrimination that perpetuates this vicious circle. So I call on states to encourage a definition that is inclusive, intersectionally minded, and also respects freedom of general belief. So you cannot define Islamophobia by excluding some groups that define themselves as Muslim. It has to be inclusive. So these are some of the recommendations that I highlight. A key thing, of course, being making sure that the rule of law protects everybody, and that we are mindful of what can happen with indirect discrimination as well. I shall end there and wait for any questions and comments others may have. Thank you.
Ahmed, thank you very much for the scene setter and for sharing those insights. You've given us quite some food for thought. I would now like to turn to my colleague Tommaso Chiamparino, who since July 2018 is the European Commission's coordinator on combating anti-Muslim hatred. Tommaso, your work is full-time on these complex issues. Could you tell us a little bit about what exactly your role is and how you see the EU's policies develop in terms of this fight against anti-Muslim hatred? What are the trends you see? Tommaso.
Thank you very much, Merete, and thanks, Ahmed, Ambassador, and all the ones that are listening from the States Mission and representatives of civil society and experts. Let me first of all start by expressing my sincere gratitude and admiration to Ahmed Shaheed. Gratitude, first of all, because a work like the one you have undertaken is extremely timely and needed. It contributes to surface a concerning reality of our times in the EU and around the world. Hatred and discrimination, as you said, grounded on religion, and in particular anti-Muslim hatred, is taking worrying dimensions, representing a threat to the full enjoyment of fundamental rights and freedoms by large parts of our populations, as you announced already in your introduction. And if no high voices like yours are raised, it risks to remain untackled and without adequate responses. And admiration, because after some years now as a coordinator on combating anti-Muslim hatred, it must say that it's the first time I'm confronted with such a systematic and thorough effort to embrace all the dimensions, the nuances, and even the contentious points, and give the fullest account of the phenomenon and its challenges, aiming for it to be as objective as possible. So it will be a fantastic reference to inform our future work in this field. So you asked me, Merete, why and what are we doing, and why is it urgent to tackle anti-Muslim hatred and discrimination? Well, as also Ahmed Shaheed points in his report, hate crime data are structurally missing, and especially in terms of breakdown per grounds, and their collection should be stepped up. But there are a few contexts where these are available, and when they are, they're actually quite alarming. For example, the federal government in Germany collects yearly data on hate crime, including by breaking down information on the different grounds. And well, the 2020 figures that have been anticipated recently and available also in media articles show that in spite of several lockdowns, there have been more than 2 episodes of hate crime against Muslims per day. And hate crime against Muslims, or people perceived to be Muslim, is not the only manifestation of anti-Muslim biases. There are consequences in terms of discrimination and inequality in access to employment, housing, health, and education, as the report by Ahmed is showing. According to the Fundamental Rights Agency survey, EU Fundamental Rights Agency survey of 2017, 1/3 of the respondents among Muslim population said that they have experienced discrimination on the ground of religion when looking for a job. Muslims, or people perceived to be Muslims, are often exposed to risks of stigmatization and discrimination in the context of security and anti-terrorism policies, which not only may infringe on their fundamental rights, but may also negatively impact on the trust that Muslim people living in the EU have in democratic institutions. And we have data that show that this bank of trust is conspicuous and should not be wasted. The COVID-19 pandemic has also unfortunately contributed to the exacerbation of inequalities, and Muslim communities were affected too. We have evidence of hate speech and conspiracy theories, scapegoating Muslims as if they were the cause of the spread of the virus. And a study just published a couple of days ago by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue on France confirms these negative trends in the online sphere. And it's actually the same study, and here I'd like to add an important point, shows that actually intolerance and hatred against Muslims is often associated with hatred and intolerance on other grounds: gender, ethnicity, anti-Arab, North African sentiments in Europe, migration status, and skin colors, which is a proof that it is important to have multiple lenses when dealing with this phenomenon, which goes beyond religious intolerance. Now let's look at the response, the other question you were having, Merete. In the EU, we have solid legislation in place. The 2008 Framework Decision on Combating Racism and Xenophobia criminalizes hate speech and hate crime on racist and xenophobic grounds, including religion. And we do also have advanced non-discrimination laws, Race Equality Directive, Employment Equality Directive, and laws to protect victims of crime, including hate crime. But EU law needs to be implemented and enforced properly, and when this is not the case, the Commission intervenes, or should intervene. And it's actually what happened very recently. October 2020, February 2021, the Commission has initiated 7 infringement procedures for inadequate transposition of the Framework Decision. And this has an impact also on the way anti-Muslim hate crime are investigated and prosecuted. And in addition, since the scope of the Framework Decision has some limitation, the Commission is working towards modifying the treaty to extend the list of EU crimes to all forms of hate crime and hate speech. However, legislation is not sufficient and needs to be complemented by robust policy efforts. Well, one important step was taken again very recently. The Commission adopted an innovative and ambitious anti-racism action plan for 2020-2025, which includes a focus on anti-Muslim hatred as a form of racism, and encourages action, in particular, to tackle the most structural forms of racism and address conscious and unconscious biases that contribute to intolerance, hatred, and discrimination. Again, a crucial point of the report by Mr. Shaheed. The Commission has then put in place, since 2015, a coordinator on combating anti-Muslim hatred, which I have the honor to be since 2018, as you said, who is in charge of ensuring a holistic approach by the different Commission services and to liaise with civil society, from hate crime policy to non-discrimination policies in the area of security or education and youth. We aim to ensure a comprehensive response, and we're conscious, as stated before, that when dealing with anti-Muslim hatred, multiple discriminations are at stake. Gender, migrant status, and religious aspects are mixing. And for this reason, we have then specific funding allocated to promote, for example, inclusion and access to employment in education, and access to employment and education for Muslim women. And then I know my time is limited, but let me highlight just 2 areas of very concrete intervention we've been prioritizing recently within the EU. The first is to engage closer to the ground with public authorities, in particular law enforcement in charge of hate crime. We currently have a pilot project in place in Italy to enhance the capacity of civil society organizations to cooperate actively with law enforcement, with the aim to increase the understanding of anti-Muslim biases in hate crime and to foster better recording and better investigation of cases. And if the project will be successful, we will export the format to other member states. The second field of action we're currently prioritizing involves journalists and media operators. Again, a point and one recommendation that is contained also in the report by Ahmed. And too often, for a variety of reasons, media are contributing to the crystallization of stereotypes, which fuel the processes of otherization of Muslims as a different social group from majority populations, depicting them with a negative connotation. We're currently developing, jointly with the European Federation of Journalists, a series of training modules for journalists on balanced narratives and storytelling when covering Islam or Muslim issues. Let me move in conclusion to the external dimension, because it is also important to highlight what we do in that direction. In line with the new EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, 2020-2024, freedom of religion or belief remains an essential pillar for our external human rights action. In the last year, we have raised concerns for FORB violation during our human rights dialogue with many dozens of countries, including on issues of violence and discrimination against Muslims. And we've taken a public stance condemning attacks against places of worship, like in Christchurch in New Zealand. And we strongly condemn prosecution, violence, and discrimination against people of all faiths, as well as non-believers. The EU has been engaging actively in the Istanbul process, which has facilitated the identification of practical solutions on combating religious intolerance. Hence, and finally, we will continue to strongly support the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur, including through our 4 resolutions in the UN fora, and by asking all countries to issue standing invitation to special procedure. Let me conclude with a quote, which is not by a major thinker, nor by a prominent politician from the past. The quote is, "The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality prevail." This is Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. And so I wonder, is there any single word here that does not justify, motivate at all levels to tackle intolerance, discrimination, and hatred against Muslims and people perceived to be Muslims in the EU? So with this question, I'll leave you to the distinguished panelists that will follow me. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. I hear you stressing multi-lenses and the need for a holistic approach. I will now turn to our panelists, and I have to say I'm truly honored to host such a prominent and experienced panel. We have with us today Professor Khaled Baidoun, scholar in residence at the Harvard University Berkman Klein Center. We have Dr. Hassia Khada, educator and former OHCHR Minority Fellow. We have Mr. Aslan Suleiman, former acting special envoy to the OIC of the U.S. State Department under Obama, the Obama administration. We have Mrs. Shada Islam, founder and managing director of the New Horizons Project. And finally, we have Mrs. Imam Abu Atta, director of the well-known NGO Tell Mama. Let me start with you, Professor Baidoun. In 2018, you published a book with the title American Islamophobia, in which you describe the foundational and modern development of Islamophobia in the US. What are the best practices that you have come across in your years of research, and what are the trends that you see?
Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon. I apologize, I had to move the mute button on. It's really exciting for me to be here and join this esteemed panel. I want to lead off by saying I was really heartened by Dr. Shaheed's adoption of the term Islamophobia as the lead sort of framework for addressing anti-Muslim animus and anti-Muslim hatred. This was a term that I championed really early on in my academic work in laying out a framework for understanding anti-Muslim hatred through delineating between what the state does in public Islamophobia or state-sponsored Islamophobia, with the more lucid and brazen forms of Islamophobia that are private in nature that take place on the ground. And I think that framework really enables not only distilling and analyzing the kind of bigotry we need to tackle with regard to Islamophobia in the United States, but also globally. But it also enables us to sort of identify and highlight the best practices for addressing and then ideally eroding this hatred inflicted upon Muslim communities. So what I've noticed in the last several years, obviously in the United States, we're surviving an administration which really ratcheted up state-sponsored Islamophobia to the utmost levels with the Trump administration. Clearly, we saw it mostly through its most cornerstone structural Islamophobic program, which was the Muslim ban. The Biden administration came in on day one and dissolved the Muslim ban, so that was good news. More sort of promising news that I think will be unfolding in the near future is because there is an administration and a president who won't be engaging in the explicit and express anti-Muslim rhetoric that the Trump administration was engaged in. There's a strong likelihood that private Islamophobia in terms of hate crimes, hate incidents on the ground will likely decline because in my work, I talk about this dialectic of Islamophobia. The more explicit state-sponsored anti-Muslim animus is, that has the effect of inciting and emboldening private Islamophobia on the ground. So the good news is the Biden administration won't be engaging in that same form of explicit anti-Muslim rhetoric, which bodes well for hate crimes and hate incidents on the ground. Some best practices and some notes of or signs of optimism is over the course of the last 4 to 5 years, we've seen Islamophobia really emerge as a cornerstone social justice and racial justice issue. We're seeing it being championed by advocacy organizations, legal organizations. We're seeing books on Islamophobia like my own being adopted by college courses and being mainstreamed into educational curricula at the collegiate level, but also at the high school and lower levels. So that is spreading and disseminating greater awareness that anti-Muslim animus and Islamophobia is a threat and is very much a formidable racial and social justice issue to be taken seriously on the same level as anti-Semitism, on the same level as homophobia, on the same level as anti-Black racism. So that is good news and a best practice that is really being championed by educators at every level of the educational process. A second thing I'd like to address is in the United States, we have the First Amendment, and the First Amendment essentially combines religious freedom with freedom of speech, with freedom of assembly. And one way in which Muslim identity is policed is by surveilling and policing the free speech and assembly of Muslim individuals. And it's been great to see organizations like the Center of Constitutional Rights, the ACLU, Palestine Legal, look to protect the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly rights of Muslims tied to activism and advocacy that isn't always necessarily religious in nature, but might be tied to political views or political perspectives. So, for instance, taking stances on American foreign policy or what's happening in Palestine, for instance. Those issues, I think, are being championed through a religious freedom framework tied to free speech. And that is really critical. So another best practice is to see these really prominent civil rights and legal organizations championing religious freedom and protecting Muslim rights through the prism of free speech. Another sort of recommendation or development I'd like to see take place is the United States is clearly not a monolith. It's not a monolith politically. It's a pretty expansive country. And we can see that Islamophobia is more intense in certain parts of the country, specifically parts of the country where more conservative political presences are stronger. So even though there might be some positive development at the federal level with regard to protecting religious freedom and then being more proactive and vigilant in attacking hate crimes and hate incidents against Muslims, and that's likely going to be the case with the Biden administration. What I'd like to see happen in the near future is government at the state level. So in states like Arkansas and states like Texas, governments which have been very vigilant about passing these anti-Sharia bills, being more proactive in enacting formidable and robust policies that punish hate crimes and hate incidents against Muslims. And not only in terms of being proactive with regard to enacting legislation that punishes that sort of activity, but being more proactive with regard to protecting Muslim communities in the form of, having police, for instance, in front of mosques during Ramadan or Iftar dinner. Those kinds of policies, I think, are really essential in parts of the country where, again, Muslim populations are sparse, and the Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment is quite strong because of the political context. So that is a development I'd like to see, and a development I'm really pushing for in my scholarship and in my research. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to field any questions. I have a lot more to say, but I know we only have 6 minutes to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Baidoun. It was wonderful to hear some of the encouraging trends also in this field, and hear you stress the importance of the terminology issue. Dr. Kata, you are an educator and a former fellow of the Minority Fellowship Program of OHCR, as well as a consultant for Amnesty International. You've done quite a lot of in-depth research on notions such as identity, race, belonging, migration, diaspora, and homelands, especially in South Asia. What is your take on this matter?
So thank you so much. I would like to begin by thanking the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief for his interventions towards defining and combating Islamophobia. As the only member in this panel located in the Global South, I would like to focus on the need to develop an inclusive definition and framework for combating Islamophobia, which is not singularly oriented towards states in the developed global north. Negative stereotypes about Islam and Muslims have been around for centuries and have been located in the European encounter with Islam and Muslims, described as Orientalism, a term that bifurcates the cognitive geographies of the Occident or the West from the Orient to East. And I say cognitive because Orientalism is a gaze, and I believe that it is not restricted by borders of the Western world. Rather, it is a function of power, both political and socio-economic. My aim will be to push you to think about Islamophobia as a phenomena which affects Muslims across the globe. The processes of Islamophobia might have started with Western Orientalism. However, today it is a contemporary power structure that constitutes Islam in a particular way. That is, it essentializes Islam not only just as a permanent, barbaric, non-modern other, but also as the permanent adversary. Hence, the concern by many states yesterday that freedom of expression gets compromised if you defend freedom of religion for Muslim communities, a discourse that threatens the universality and indivisibility of liberal human rights by casting Muslims as those people defending whom would be tantamount to defending anti-modern forces. Like Orientalism, Islamophobia also has been equated to racism, and indeed it is epistemic violence against a whole people, just like racism. However, I would argue that while there are similarities with racism, it is important, especially from the perspective of the Global South, that the imaginary of a Muslim as an Arab, a brown-skinned person, or a South Asian be challenged, as Muslims are ethnically and racially diverse and all face Islamophobia on daily basis. Therefore, Islamophobia should be understood intersectionally and inclusively so that it can inform other discriminations like racism and sexism. I stress this because when Islamophobia is understood as a Eurocentric phenomena affecting only brown bodies, it dismisses non-Western states as benign inheritors of this anti-Muslim gaze. We who were born and live in the non-West know this is not true. I would argue that the non-West also actively contributes towards developing structural anti-Muslim hate through policy and racist language. For example, post 9/11 tropes like Islam as the enemy within, Islam as a national security threat or as terror, Islamic separatism are tropes I grew up with in 1980s and 1990s, way before 9/11 happened. The language and the securitization of Muslim communities that it has justified in India have affected our lives and curtailed our opportunities for decades. Kashmir, where I am located, presents an opportunity to understand this perpetual exclusion and otherization. As has been well documented, Kashmir, as a Muslim majority area in a non-Muslim majority region, has witnessed institutionalized Islamophobia through policies of securitization and counter-militancy. Kashmir has been reduced to a governance issue, a region that needs to be disciplined. On the other hand, the voices from the ground are dismissed or criminalized as those of irrational, undemocratic, non-modern entities, or as those of national security threats, or as those of terrorists. The securitization and militarization has specifically impacted the safety and security of human rights defenders, impartiality of the press, and by extension, freedom of press. International organizations like Committee to Protect Journalists have documented arbitrary detentions, physical assaults, FIR under serious terror charges, and other threats against Kashmiri journalists by state authorities. Similarly, human rights defenders and credible internationally recognized civil society organizations have been raided under the pretext of national security. Further, new higher education rules require academicians to seek state permission before hosting discussions and debates on sensitive issues like Kashmir. High degree of surveillance and reprisals have led to self-censorship, impeding a community's right to free and full cultural development. The most violent thing that Islamophobia does to societies like mine are that it presumes guilt and puts the onus on the victim to exonerate herself without giving her the means to do so. Islamophobia curtails all rights and most adversely affects Muslim women who fight patriarchy within their communities to only encounter systems of policies and social attitudes that disadvantage them outside their communities. Therefore, in conclusion, as my recommendation, I would like to focus specifically on militarization and securitization of Muslim communities. While counter-militancy policies might be a necessity of our time, states should take into cognizance the disabling conditions that implementation of over-securitization creates, hindering access to free and fair due process, access to education, as was the case in Kashmir under partial communications ban in the last 2 years. Access to freedom of assembly. Prayers have been restricted in the state since 2019. Access to digital rights, access to medical infrastructure, and lastly, unrestricted mobility. Many Muslim communities around the world face these conditions today, including Kashmiri Muslims, and multilateral platforms should take this very seriously because unless these disabling conditions are met, other fundamental freedoms cannot be achieved. Further, it is important that securitization of Muslim communities in the name of counter-militancy be stopped. Only then we will be able to hold accountable various actors, including press and private companies like social media platforms, as many times dissent and minority rights is treated as a question of national security, leading to censorship, gagging, suspension of accounts, and surveillance. Lastly, as good practice, I believe involving the stakeholders in policy making and implementation has a positive effect, whereby the state and stakeholders can work together towards common goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khada, and also for providing a very succinct Global South perspective. We now turn to Mr. Suleiman, as I said, former acting special envoy to the OIC at the US State Department under Obama. You used to engage with the OIC and a number of its member states on key foreign policy issues, such as human rights, countering violent extremism, health, education, entrepreneurship, science, and technology. Now, combating anti-Muslim hatred was equally high on your agenda. Would you be able to share with us some of the progress that you saw happening in that regard, but also in light of your more recent responsibility, if I may, I would like to invite you, if you could elaborate on the challenges as you see them at hand in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and China. Thank you very much, Aslan.
Thank you so much, Marata, and also thanks to the sponsors, to Special Rapporteur Shaheed, and to all the panelists. Well, we were able to make progress, and I think I hope that we will be able to make progress once again now that we have a new administration with the Biden-Harris administration that's committed to re-engaging internationally and multilaterally. And I think there were a number of ways in which the United States, but also international partners, including the European Union and many OIC member states, in addition to the OIC itself, were able to collaborate jointly. Special Rapporteur Shaheed mentioned the UN HRC Resolution 1618. That was a resolution that really came about because of the US OIC engagement, specifically on the issue of freedom of religion or belief. And that resolution, importantly, displaced a really pernicious resolution called the Defamation of Religions Resolution, which was used in order to promote restrictions on speech and freedom of religion in the guise of blasphemy laws and other restrictive laws. And so 1618 was seen as a kind of breakthrough in the sense that it was an action plan. It was a list of action-oriented items that the entire UN community has agreed to. And that consensus is important. And Special Rapporteur Shaheed mentioned the series of meetings, which has been called the Istanbul process, which I hope can be revived because that's an important way in which we can continue to press states to actually implement the commitments that are made in that resolution. And one of the important commitments in that resolution is to have political leaders speaking out and condemning Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment. And that was sadly lacking for the past 4 years at the highest level in the United States. In fact, it was just the opposite. We had a president who was actually actively fomenting and promoting anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia. And it's important that we have political leaders in office who will actively do the opposite and condemn it instead of promoting it. The other, I think, really concrete way in which we were able to address this in the past was that, and you'll remember this, Maretta and others, in January 2017, the United States, in collaboration with the EU, Canada, and the OIC, hosted for the first time ever a high-level forum on combating anti-Muslim hatred at the United Nations. This year marks 4 years since that event. Next year will be 5 years. Perhaps next year is a time to revive that initiative because sadly, we have seen a number of instances, horrific instances in which anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Muslim hatred, Islamophobia has on the ground been manifested in the worst ways. And you mentioned Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and China, meaning Xinjiang and the Uyghur situation as key examples of that. And sadly, you're absolutely right. In Myanmar and in Xinjiang, we have active genocides that are occurring. In Myanmar, the Rohingya population there had been subjected to decades of persecution and repression, including really horrendous anti-Muslim, anti-Rohingya hate speech, the type of hate speech that's described in Special Rapporteur Shaheed's report, dehumanizing hate speech, characterizing that community as animalistic, as snakes, as jackals, as fish that's worthy of destruction and exclusion. And that atmosphere of hate speech, that atmosphere of discriminatory and restrictive policies led to the murder of tens of thousands of Rohingya, the mass rape and gang rape of tens of thousands of Rohingya women, really horrific and brutal violence in which men, women, children, the disabled, the elderly, all were specifically targeted for murder and horrific violence. In fact, the military had ordered its soldiers to kill and exterminate the Rohingya and to burn down all of their villages. And all of that is really a horrific example, an extreme example of what Islamophobia can lead to. And we're seeing that as well in China, in Xinjiang, where you have the massive industrial scale level of internment of Uyghur Muslims, the direct targeting of Uyghur Muslims on the basis of their religion and cultural identity, the forced labor of those individuals, the destruction of their religious property, the banning of their ability to speak their language and practice their religion. and a really disgusting focus on reducing their birth rates, which indicates the genocidal intent behind those policies, and a massive campaign of sexual violence against Uyghur women, including rape on a systematic scale. And this again is a sad but real example of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred, and it highlights the urgent need for action. We have to get past any rhetorical or linguistic debates about what this is, and we need to focus on actually putting the international pressure required to prevent these types of genocides, these types of mass incidents of violence from occurring. Dr. Khader mentioned Kashmir. There are also very significant and deep concerns about mass violence in India, and we have seen episodes of that happen, targeting Muslims on the basis of their religion. And Sri Lanka, we are also seeing a similar challenge in terms of state sponsored hatred and rhetoric that has targeted the Muslim community there, in collaboration with Buddhist extremist elements, which are linked to the Buddhist extremist elements in Myanmar, that has been part of that phenomenon of anti-Muslim violence and hatred there. And recently in Sri Lanka, that anti-Muslim hatred has manifested itself in the restrictions on the Muslim practice of burial, and it was an attempt by the government to couch that restriction in the context of COVID-19 restrictions. But you know, health experts and others have clearly shown that there's no basis in terms of forced cremation as a COVID-19 prevention measure, and in fact, it was principally an element designed to target and attack that Muslim community. And we've seen the government shift their policy because of international pressure, but really that shows that it's international pressure that's required in order to have these discriminatory laws repealed and rolled back. And so I urge the members of the Human Rights Council to once again adopt a resolution focused on Sri Lanka in order to ensure that these acts of discrimination and violence don't continue to recur. And I also urge the Human Rights Council members to adopt resolutions that are focusing on Xinjiang and the situation of the Uyghurs in China, and to continue the focus on the Rohingya in Myanmar. Because that pressure is essential. You don't, unless you have the international scrutiny and a united front behind that, we won't achieve results. And so I urge the OIC to once again be a partner in focusing in particular on the challenge in Xinjiang. The OIC has done a really commendable job of focusing on the Rohingya challenge, and it has been supporting the Gambia in its case at the International Court of Justice in order to challenge Myanmar for its violations of the Genocide Convention. But more can be done. And so I look forward to a revival of the Istanbul process. I look forward perhaps to another high-level meeting at the UN, which the EU and Canada can work on, and other concerted international efforts to really address this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arslan, and thank you also for really putting the onus on the action and the need for international pressure. Circling back now to Europe, I would like to introduce Mrs. Shada Islam, founder of and managing director of New Horizons Project, which seeks to promote diversity in all its facets, believes in the importance of building inclusive societies and creating more understanding and convergence among people, communities, countries in a divided world. Shada, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Merete, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. Today I have to confess, having heard from Ahmed Shaheed and Tommaso and others, I'm torn between a moment of deep frustration and anger, but also I want to dwell on. And I'll tell you why I think there is some hope, at least here in Europe, as we move forward into this very, very challenging world. And my hope is that Europe will be able to live up to its motto of unity in diversity, and in that diversity include racial diversity and religious diversity as well. So why this moment is defining in my view? First of all, COVID-19, believe it or not, has been quite an important, significant milestone in politics in Europe. It has highlighted, Merete and others, the essential role played by workers, often migrant workers, and often migrant workers of Muslim descent. And that, I think, has shown that we are citizens of Europe and we play a vital role in the upkeep and the running and the security and future of Europe. And this message has gone across loudly and clearly across the European Union. The second important development, which has had repercussions across the European Union, is the Black Lives Matter movement, which of course followed a very tragic event in the United States, but also erupted and led to demonstrations of racial justice, demands for racial justice across the European Union, from Black and brown people, people of color in Europe, also white citizens of Europe. And that has led our governments in Europe to recognize and admit that there is a problem of racism in Europe, as Tommaso has about, and that includes, of course, racism against Muslims. The third development, and Tommaso has made references to it, is the adoption of the anti-racism plan, European Commission, last September. And that first time, I think, really recognizes the existence of systemic racism, structural, institutional racism across the European Union. But it also, and this is very important, recognizes unconscious bias, and then finally recognizes and acknowledges that there is lack of diversity in European Union institutions, something that I have been campaigning for a very long time. Let's make Brussels less white. So these are all good and significant steps, but I think we need to go further. We need to be more ambitious, and we need to take steps. And that's going to be challenging because it goes to the heart of who is a European and what is Europe. And I'm talking about changing, transforming the narrative of Europe, the story of Europe, what it means to be a European in the 21st century. How do we identify ourselves as Europeans? Now, it's no surprise to everyone here that we have heard the populists and we've heard the far-right politicians across Europe talking about a Europe that is white, a Europe that is Christian, a Europe that is exclusive, a Europe that within the comfort zone of us, true Europeans, white and Christian, and the others who are tolerated, needed, but are never really acknowledged as full-fledged, active citizens committed to the European Union. And that is a self-confessing exclusion, self-comforting exclusion of those who are not considered to be white and Christian. Now, this narrative has been adopted, unfortunately, by the media as well, and we have heard references to it, but also accepted and embraced by too many mainstream politicians across the European Union. It is a groupthink in the worst possible form, and it's made worse by the lack of cognitive diversity across the European Union in the institutions as well. So Muslims are seen as perpetual outsiders, as exotic and foreign, and we've heard people say that they can never be accepted as full-fledged Europeans. Our leaders, unfortunately, perpetuate that legend, that myth, if you like, by talking to foreign leaders about the problems and the challenges and their of young Muslims. So exotic foreigners forever. But as I said, and that's where my hope comes from, this is changing slowly, but slowly it is changing. And that's really being driven by self-confident, self-assured Muslims who are demanding their right to be recognized as full-fledged, active European citizens with our rights and our obligations. They are using legal means to secure the rights and asking for the implementation of laws that Tommaso has talked about, enforcement of the laws that do exist in the rule book but need to be enforced with more rigor and energy. And they're proving by actions and their words that they are actually law-abiding citizens, tax-paying citizens. They are mayors, they're business leaders, they're teachers, they're sports stars, and much more. And they are not living in what many politicians in Europe claim in separate societies or creating their own separate universes. They are not extremists, they are part of the mainstream. Their concerns and their priorities are those of all European citizens. They worry about their health. The pandemic, of course, has affected many minority communities more than others. They worry about their security. They worry about their children's education. They worry about getting jobs, and when they have them, about keeping those jobs. They are not terrorists. They are Democrats. They are voters. They are citizens who cast their votes, and they make this Europe a vibrant democracy. And their participation now is desperately needed if we are to have an inclusive green recovery. So let me just say, there is no magic wand that is going to make all come true, bring about the changes that I want. There will be no overnight changes. There is too much anti-Muslim hatred, too much history there to be overcome in one single stroke of any one magic wand. No one European leader can do that either. This has to be a collective effort. But I believe that some steps have begun. Self-assured Muslims in Europe are taking their own destiny in their hands and making sure that their voice is heard through legal means across the European Union. Diversity, or the lack of diversity, is now being acknowledged as a major problem. And it's simple, really, in the end. European Muslims are European. They're not going to go anywhere else. This is Europe. This is our home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shada, and thank you also for being this voice. You are known to be an opinion maker in your own capacity, in way beyond Brussels. So it's a real pleasure to have you here today. Our last speaker is Mrs. Imam Abu Atta, and I'm particularly happy to have you as a guest here today, as you're the director of the NGO Tel Mama, a leading organization when it comes to supporting victims of anti-Muslim hatred, but also of measuring and monitoring anti-Muslim incidents. One of Tel Mama's starting points is countering anti-Muslim bigotry, is in a sense a human rights work. How does that translate into your work?
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dr. Shaheed, for the report that has been put together that highlights really the level of anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia that is growing globally, and really for your recommendations on actions to be taken. And thank you for colleagues who have already highlighted some of the incidents and some of the facts around anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia, similar to what we see in the UK as well. So we in Tel Mama, we're a team that hold values of universal human rights at the core of our work and our service. Whilst it focuses, and Tel Mama focuses on supporting victims of anti-Muslim hatred, we also support any individual who contact us after being targeted for a hate incident or crime. Individuals should have the right to live their lives free from fear and not to be targeted because of their identities. And that is not just for Muslim communities, that is for anyone. Because of our work and because of the essence of the work being focused on human rights, it is based on ensuring the universal human rights. It is based on ensuring that we empower, we educate, and we advocate for victims of anti-Muslim hatred, and we advocate against all forms of hatred. This means advocating and countering anti-Muslim hatred, but it also means supporting and advocating for minority groups within Muslim communities. Intra-Muslim bigotry and hatred would also be actively challenged and encountered by Tel Mama. We also take pride in the service we provide to victims and those most vulnerable to anti-Muslim hatred. And we continuously strive to provide a reliable, confidential, and trusted service for victims, witnesses, and the partners that we work with. The essence of human rights in our work means that we stand firmly and challenge all forms of hatred and intolerance. We speak loudly about this, we work with partner agencies, we run campaigns around this, and we stand firmly in solidarity with the LGBT+ communities, Jewish communities, the GRT communities, the disabled communities, and many other communities in their fight against intolerance and prejudice. We defend all communities, including the rights of LGBT+ Muslims, when they are attacked by other members of the wider society or by members within their own faith communities. It also means that human rights and the essence of our work is human rights for all, and that all the elements of intersectionality is understood. We highlight intersectionality within our work. It is an element that we need to focus on, we need to bring to the forefront, because we all mentioned, and Shada has put this very, very, very nicely and very beautifully, we all carry multiple identities. We're all She said we're Europeans, we're Muslims, she's a female. There's so many identities that we all carry. And we need to always bear and take into account the element of intersectionality when we talk about hate crime, when we talk about identity, when we talk about each and every one of us. So we need to ensure that intersectionality is understood and that people receive a service that takes into account their multiple identities. And sometimes even it is complex identities that we carry. It also means that listening is at the core work of Talmama. It means as well that we need to have empathy when we're serving people and communities. And empathy is a key thing when we're talking about hatred and intolerance and challenging it. We actually empathize, we work around the element of empathy, and we put ourselves in the shoes and in the shoes of the victims that come and report into us. And this is a fundamental to actually ensuring that we're taking a human rights approach in our service. It also means that we ensure the dignity of the victim. The dignity of the victim is something that is many victims come to us as always being one of the things that hurts them the most when they're being attacked or insulted or abused on the streets or even in the online world. So we ensure the dignity of the victims by supporting their dignity, their security, and I highlight the word security. I think it's been mentioned by other colleagues as well beforehand. I think when the mobility and the movement of individuals, the change of behavior, the change of looks of Muslim communities worldwide has been at the forefront of them feeling that they're always targeted is something that we need to look at and reflect on and address. So we address that by supporting their dignity, their security, and their desire to be heard. Shada mentioned the word make their voice heard. And making your voice heard is the strapline that we use at Talmama. It's to make the victim's voice heard. And we do that throughout the process and throughout the journey that we serve victims by. This is fundamental to taking a human rights approach to our work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mata. There's plenty of material to reflect upon, and it's a true pleasure to hear of your important work. Now, we're going to go back to Ahmed now, but as our co-sponsor Canada is in a bit of a time bend, I would like to, before we do that, Ahmed, with your permission, just quickly pass the floor to Canada. Deputy Permanent Rep Tamara Wahini, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. Thank you for the space. Canada's very honored to co-sponsor today's event, and I personally am very honored to follow on these very impressive and, in many instances, moving panelists. And a few of them are some old friends going way back as well. It's nice to see the struggle continues. I wanted to express my special thanks also to you, Dr. Shaheed, for your latest report, which examines the pervasive yet poorly understood still nature of anti-Muslim hatred and your recommendations to address and mitigate its impacts. We applaud your efforts to document the experiences of affected communities and are pleased that Canada's Muslim community participated in the consultations. Anti-Muslim hatred through the dissemination of intolerant narratives, through discrimination or even violence, as some of the panelists have flagged, is felt worldwide. Muslim women in particular are disproportionately targeted. And Canada is not immune. And again, this is why many of the panelists' comments today were struck a particular chord for me. We strive to be an inclusive country that respects diversity, and we work actively, we hope, to combat Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. Eradication is an essential component of our domestic anti-racism strategy. Internationally, Canada condemns the rise of governmental restrictions against members of Muslim communities. States have an obligation to review policies, laws, regulations perpetuating discrimination and to legally prohibit discrimination. And we will continue to call upon governments to work together to combat anti-Muslim hatred and all forms of intolerance by mobilizing a human rights-based approach, as a number of the panelists have flagged. Just a quick question, if I may. We appreciated, Dr. Shaheed, your participation in last week's side event, Combating Anti-Semitism. that Canada hosted with the World Jewish Congress, together with the EU and Israel. I notice there's been some references by some of the other panelists as well. What are the linkages that you see between anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Semitism, and other forms of discrimination? And how can we best address these issues comprehensively? How to achieve a linked up approach? Thank you very much again for this wonderful event.
Thank you very much, Tamara, and thank you for this excellent question. I think we will go back and now allow for Ahmed to reflect on also what the last question about how do we respond in a coordinated and a comprehensive way to different kinds of xenophobia rather than sort of fragmentation that we sometimes see, but also to what you have heard from the other panelists. Ahmed, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Really quite a lot of food for thought from very excellent presentations from the panelists. Just a few sort of thoughts that stuck with me in the time I have here. Before I come to that, in my consultations, I came across two very useful terms. In Canada, the term is inclusion, and there's a lot of focus on creating inclusion as an important aspect of the way forward. In Europe, we hear the human rights-based approach. Of course, everybody does it, but there's a focus on non-discrimination and the human rights approach. In New Zealand, I came across the concept of belonging. And this sort of resonates with what Shada was saying about the need to understand that Muslims are part of Europe, they are in Europe, they're not going anywhere, and therefore that sense that they also belong to Europe, whatever country they are in, is an important dimension. This contrasts with the old ideas of integration, still relevant, but assimilation, integration, and sometimes living together are coming up. But these contrast well with the ideas of inclusion and belonging, but of course buttressed by the human rights approach and non-discrimination. So this final bit about the human rights approach is the answer I have to offer to the Canadian Deputy PR, in the sense that taking a human rights approach means we're giving equal concern, equal treatment for everybody. We have equal concern for everybody. Equal concern means blind, that we have to look at the specificities of each phenomenon to be able to do that justice. But within an overall framework of equal respect and equal concern, and therefore equal dignity as a way to go forward. We must be very careful not to fragment those who are seeking justice for their positions. We must be also careful not to over-victimize. In other words, not to promote victimology amongst claimants, so that we create a hierarchy or what I call victim Olympics amongst various claimants. Avoiding that, if you take a human rights-based approach, we can do that. But I just want to quickly, go back to this point about multiple identities. An important point Amartya Sen makes about his contribution to how we cope with this modern age. The fact that we tend to essentialize people to one identity and forget the fact that we meet them in a variety of identities. In Albania, on my country mission, I came across how the three different communities there, well, you can make it 4 or 5 if you wish, but three, if you like, broad communities, they don't describe as Orthodox, Catholic, or Muslim, but they're Albanian, and they see multiple identities comfortably overlaying each other in a very, if you like, a coherent fashion. So they don't see a Muslim or a Catholic or Orthodox. They just see an Albanian or in multiple ways, man, woman, doctor, whichever. So they see the people as just like them, rather than someone that is apart from them in a different sense, without undermining, of course, their separate identities. So in regard to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and other forms, there's a family resemblance in all of these things, because the way the processes are often similar. It's about exercise of power by a dominant group over a group seen to be vulnerable or weak, and therefore using that power hierarchy to exclude, discriminate, dehumanize, and of course we see what happens when that carries on. So there is that family resemblance in the way the perpetrators create imaginaries and attack them. If there was no Jewish person, if there was no Muslim, the bigot will invent them, as it was, as been said before. So it is about the perpetrator than more about the person. So the point that Iman made about empathy is so crucial. I've been living long enough to see how the world appears to have changed the narrative about Muslims from the 80s onwards. Somewhere around late 80s and early 90s, suddenly, a Muslim didn't become visible anymore. It wasn't a Muslim. The person became the hudud laws or the Sharia law or something in scripture. So the Muslim ceased to exist, and then some understanding, essentialized version of scripture became what every Muslim was. So we ceased to see who the person is and began to see an imaginary. Now, in my consultations, nobody suggested that states should diminish their commitment to security. All they're saying is this is going the wrong way, that you don't enhance security by over-securitization of a community, in fact, undermine the ability to spot the dangers and address them when you over-securitize. So I think subjecting all these security laws to a proportionate analysis, as the Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism has been advocating, is an important one. So to add to finally complete this, so a lot of things said, I also want to highlight the important point that Khadija made about the inclusivity and intersectionality and having an understanding that works well in different contexts, because all forms of racism can be context specific. Certainly hate speech is context specific. So we need to be mindful of that. And finally, I just want to add that to the points made by Iman and others, that our response should be a mix of things. As Mr. Suleiman said, we have seen time and time again how international pressure does work. So we must not give up that. We have to use that. At another level, we also have to use the legal tools as well. But beyond that, we have to recognize that solidarity is the antidote towards to hatred. That the hate speakers who seek to stigmatize and dehumanize a person needs to be pushed back with solidarity with the person that's been targeted. So rather than use laws to curtail speech, we need to have common human decency to show that the other person is just like us, and we demonstrate solidarity and empathy towards them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. And I think it was useful to have you come in with a refresh button here. I would now like to invite also the audience to use the chat box on WebEx, and while doing so, admire the very nice layout that our colleagues have designed specifically for this event. I see that Amnesty International has posted their guide on how to combat anti-Muslim hatred. But before taking questions, I'd like to turn to the two other of our partners who have requested in advance to be able to take the floor. So we are honored to have Pakistan here with us as coordinator of the OIC. So Your Excellency, Ambassador Hashmi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. We are thankful to the EU delegation for organizing this very important conversation. And I think we heard a lot of thoughtful observations. And we were really impressed with the contributions that have been made by several speakers. Just a few remarks. I want to also commend Ahmed Shaheed for a very well-researched and widely consulted report that he has put out. In terms of the, of course, I don't want to comment too much on the report, just to say that a lot of very thoughtful observations. The findings to us are in many ways a revalidation of what was well known, but perhaps less acknowledged in some circles. In terms of the actors, I think Ahmed Shaheed has listed out the actors that are there, who are, who have their own share to perpetuate or promote what is going on in terms of sections of politicians or media or parts of the academic community. I think in terms of the significance of the report, we find the urgency of doing something about it, and this platform or conversations like this are, from our point of view, are not only very important but essential as well. I think from where we are as Pakistan delegation and also in our capacity as OIC coordinator, what is more important and in the ecosystem that we work, we're always looking for what to do and how do we move forward. So in that sense, I think it's clear that the nature of this phenomena is such that we require a multi-stakeholder approach. It's not for one, it's not just the governments which can do that, or the politicians or others. So it has to be at several levels. So, for instance, within the Geneva community, it's the part of it is the Human Rights Council, the OHCHR, as well as and other international organizations. At another level, it is the parliaments or the politicians, the civil society, the international human rights organizations. But then at the third level is also the sections of mainstream media, and especially these social media platforms, the companies that are there. So in a nutshell, it's a long haul, as others have also said. There is no easy way out, but this sort of engagement and dialogue are essential, as I said. And we, on our part, we are working very closely with the EU on some of these issues, and we are in regular contact, and we plan to remain in touch and engage each other and try and take these conversations forward. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And then we have a requested speaker, Councillor Daniel Cronenfeld from the US.
Hi, thank you very much. I would just like to echo the thanks of others to, oh, there I am, to the EU mission and to the speakers today for a really interesting discussion. I'm really struck, having listened so far, at the diversity of the comments that we've heard from the panelists who have really highlighted sort of the breadth of Islamophobia, which, it has a single name, but very clearly not a single manifestation. And that's really been quite clear in the comments that we've heard. Dr. Shaheed, I had the chance to listen in on your interactive dialogue yesterday, and I'm delighted to say that to generate that much controversy, you must be doing something right. So congratulations on that. We clearly heard a lot of commentary about your approach, and I was personally kind of delighted to hear that you've generated that controversy. I can say that we have commended your approach, and we commend the report that you did for its cross-cutting nature, and it's an approach that has shed light on the many ways that anti-Muslim hatred has reared its head throughout the world today, from my own country of the United States to Europe, and in some particularly appalling forms, as panelists here have mentioned, in Burma and Xinjiang, and we're concerned about what we've seen in Sri Lanka as well. I'm glad that the discussion has touched on the U.S. as well. As Tamara said regarding Canada, we've obviously not been immune to this problem in the U.S. And this is something, speaking very frankly, it's something I'm glad our administration has been able to say. And it's something that we can focus on. At the same time, we have, as one of our most central tenets, the notion that everyone has the right to hold any belief or no belief. And so, as is so often the case, there remains a real divide between this notion that we have as central to who we are as Americans and the reality on the ground for many Americans. And I think a lot of the commentary that we saw about this sort of essentialization, or the concerns about essentializing people, really, have a particular application in the U.S. where we have such a historical diversity in our population, but at the same time we have some sort of tropes that have been surfaced about who has claims on being American and who doesn't, in some sense. So I was pleased to see that. Dr. Shaheed, I am particularly interested in your recommendation that various organs at the UN, and particularly OHCHR, should increase their collaboration and cooperation with special procedures in order to take action on discrimination, hostility, and violence emanating from Islamophobia. I was wondering what that looks like in a practical sense, given what we see, sort of the architecture of the UN system. How can the UN system mobilize to counter Islamophobia in some of its more covert forms, as we've seen, for example, in employment discrimination, to some of its most overt forms, as we've discussed here, looking at Xinjiang and the plight of the Uyghurs, as well as the Rohingya in Burma. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. But once again, thank you very much for including us, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And if I may just add myself that back in January 2017, we actually co-sponsored together with the US, Canada, and the OIC at New York 4 days before President Trump administration took over, a high-level event on anti-Muslim hatred and bigotry, where we together focused on what it is we can achieve together if we truly want to, as you also say, be honest, and as the European ambassador said, address also the shortcomings among ourselves. And what we strived to do back then was precisely to bring in grassroots speakers who could showcase how they work together on the ground to stand up for each other. And I think if there is interest in maybe having a second go at something like that, there would be, we could definitely consider. But I'm also very keen to get back to Shaheed and hear some of his responses back, because there's both the issue of sort of the urgency of action, but also what you suggest in your report. Ahmed, if I may myself, I hear that in your recommendations you stress very much that we should use the existing tools, but use them better. At the same time, we heard from the Canadian ambassador or deputy perm rep that she asked about how we actually try to do this in a more joined up factor. In the anti-Semitism report, you recommended to the UN that they have a focal point for anti-Semitism. If we were to continue this sort of linear thinking, we would have thought there would be a focal point also for anti-Muslim hatred. Now, shouldn't the way ahead be that we try to join forces across these kinds of different kinds of xenophobia and hatred, regardless of creed and color? Ahmed?
Thank you. It's a very important question. You will notice I do not make a recommendation that should be a focal point to cover Islamophobia, because I think every kind of hatred, although there is, like I said, family resemblance, require close scrutiny to see what is the best response that we can tailor for its particular purposes. Now, the UN itself has a real problem with anti-Semitism, because UN is many parts. Some parts of the UN are seen, or in fact do have a serious problem with that. So there is a need to coordinate internally as to how it responds to this. And this can include, in my report at the time, was very much focused on somebody being able to offer training to its staff on different ways anti-Semitism comes out. So in some ways it can be very pervasive, very unconscious, and can have very negative impacts. Islamophobia can be similar, but it requires a different, perhaps, type of approach, because there's less of a problem within the UN system than its response outside. And that's why I talk about a joined up approach amongst different special rapporteurs. So we have the rapporteur on countering terrorism doing a lot of work with overlaps with my work, rapporteur on racism, rapporteur on minority rights, the working group on women, on discrimination against women. All of us are doing work relevant to this theme, but we haven't really put the dots together. So that is something to do. And of course, there are initiatives within the UNHCR, such as the Faith for Rights Initiative. And of course, it is right now done correctly in a different blind way, but it can also be focused on making sure that we do build in these sorts of issues, because we've been so accustomed to seeing that we cannot address anti-Muslim hatred because of the blasphemy laws and so on. That is a false antagonism. That doesn't really exist. We just create this over time. We are not talking about silence and speech. We're talking about actually addressing the actual discrimination individuals feel or face, and of course the misconceptions about how that comes about. So there is a difference here, and there's a different approach. And the Alliance for Civilizations already is doing work in this area. We can look at how more effective they can become. We can look at also how the UN might look at the counterterrorism architecture. So my top recommendation for the UN here is not a focal point, but to subject its own approach towards countering violent extremism, and also ask member states to put an audit of the counterterrorism policies more stringently into human rights framework. That's the sort of that will be most beneficial for tackling Islamophobia. So I think different types of hatred require different approaches, but you're right, they must all be joined up within a coherent framework. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ahmed. I would like to offer the panelist a very short time, but just to say, what is your top recommendation after hearing this debate today and yourself contributing? Could we maybe start in inverted order? Iman?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this, and thank you for the insight and input, Dr. Shaheed. I think maybe two things from our end. One, standing really firmly against all types of hatred and intolerance, standing with other communities in their fight against hatred and intolerance. And equally, and lastly, one of the things I think that we need maybe to push as well, and maybe has not been touched on this panel, but has been touched on already in Dr. Shaheed's report, is really how do we ensure that we tackle online hate speech. It's one thing I think that is today manifesting so much in the physical attacks, physical abuse that we're seeing on our streets, and we always talk about the online world separately to the physical world, and they totally both connect, and we need to address this.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that Tomasa would have lots to say on that, but right now, Shada, your top recommendation?
I would say two, really. First is enforce the laws that we have. There are many out there that need to be tightened, and enforcement has to become a big priority. Make sure also that police training is available and is prioritized by the European Union institutions. Very, very important. And also please stop obsessing over how women dress and whether or not they wear headscarves or whether or not they should wear headscarves. So change the story of what it means to be a European. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Aslan?
Yeah, I would just say that we have the platforms, we have the mechanisms, we have the forums like the Human Rights Council. We need to use them. We need to have concerted action to focus on the emergency situations like in Myanmar, like in Xinjiang, and crises as they come up. We have early warning mechanisms where we can see that disturbing trends are arising in India, in Sri Lanka. So we need to take the affirmative action. We need to use the platforms we have and the mechanisms we have. And I think it's really a matter of getting that political will and having that actual concerted action. And frankly, we need all players involved. We've seen some players like the OIC be active in Myanmar, but unfortunately less active on Xinjiang, and that has to change.
Thank you very much, Aslan. Hacha?
Hi, yes. I think for us, at least where I am located, we see a lot of efficacy of multilateral platforms like the United Nations and its many bodies. So I think if multilateral platforms could be included, especially special procedures and treaty bodies could have better access to situations where maybe Islamophobia is becoming more and more serious and sort of perpetrating into offline violence and mobilization, that would really help. So more transparency in terms of the international commitment states have when they come to the UN, and probably looking towards advocacy at these multilateral platforms like the HRC, etc. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Khaled?
Yeah, my biggest recommendation would be let's dismantle the war on terror, and be more honest with anti-terror investigation and prosecution. Right, sort of like demystify this conflation of terrorism with Muslim identity. Somebody asked a question earlier about what ties anti-Semitism to Islamophobia and so forth and so on. And that is what ties it is this, revitalized, reignited moment of white supremacy that views anybody who isn't white and Christian as a bona fide citizen. So what we have to do is frame terrorism far more broadly and investigate and prosecute individuals who engage in terror activity, regardless of what religion they profess and adhere to. And really, finally, just do away with this inextricable conflation of Muslim identity with terrorism, not only in the United States, but in Europe, India, China. Because what ties all of our conversations is that it's the war on terror that has disseminated Islamophobia as a global phenomenon and pushed governments, whether in China, India, so forth and so on, to adopt the American language and the American lexicon in the war on terror, which has enabled the intensification of Islamophobia.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Khaled. Tommaso.
Yes, I mean, a lot have been said, but let me add maybe just to what Shada mentioned in terms of training for law enforcement. I believe training, awareness raising, and education could be also and should be broader than law enforcement, and look at unpacking unconscious biases in administration at different levels, and in general, more knowledge about Islam, Muslims, and inclusion in general at different levels. And the second one, alliance building, I would say, amongst at the international level, so different contexts that were mentioned, different jurisdictions cooperating on this, but also, and this is something we're doing from our perspective, very locally, and look at the role of cities, local government, and how they could have an impact in tackling this specific form of intolerance. And also across civil society organizations, trying to build bridges, bit like Telmama is doing with other groups and communities, all working under the anti-racism and human rights frameworks. So this would be my two main points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. In light of the late hour, and also that Shaheed has been in the line of fire for the last 2 days, I will spare you, Shaheed, also because we know your recommendations. We just have to read it if we didn't do that already. So I would just like to bid you all, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, a kind farewell. But before doing so, thank you really very much for today's debate, which was both rich, honest, and encouraging. There are enough problems out there. The art is to spot the opportunities and to speak up about the injustices. I think I can speak for us all here when I say that we leave this virtual room very much motivated and in full recognition that there is an absolute and acute need to continue cooperating constructively at all levels, as the Pakistani ambassador said, also multi-stakeholder. You can't legislate tolerance and respect for diversity. It has to become from within. And with this, I thank you, and I wish you a lovely end of the day and a nice weekend. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.